All right, this next section here, we're going to start first with the homework assignment number 1. And so if you'll take a moment and open up a second tab of this form and analysis page so that you'll be able to follow along with the score of this arietta by Grieg, which is homework number 1. Located on the web page. So go ahead and stop the video right now and load up that page, and then we'll talk about this. All right, so what I wanted you to do was to look at the first phrase of this little character piece, and I asked you to analyze the cadence that is in the 4th measure. So I'll just play through that here so you have that in your ear. And so homophonic texture, basically you have harmony sounding in the 16th notes in the inner voice that's shared between the tenor and the alto, and soprano has the melody. Bass has a tonic pedal tone underneath this entire phrase. All right, so you're going to hear. So we're especially looking at the second semiphrase. So this is an example of 2 semiphrases. One thing I might mention is that just because you have something that's slurred doesn't mean necessarily that it's a phrase, or doesn't denote the phrase construction. Has to do more with things having to do with taking a breath or with bowing and so forth. So anyway, the basic harmony of this, it just has 2 harmonies. So you just have the tonic harmony, it's in E flat major. So you just have and then the harmony changes to, so it is a 7/7, so it's built on the leading tone on D. So you see you have a D, an F, an A flat, and a C flat. And that harmony is then continued in the 3rd measure. And then you have the cadence that occurs at the end of that first phrase. And so basically the progression is going to be a 7/7 in the 3rd measure. So the question was, is this an example of a shifted cadence or a delayed cadence, or is it both? And so the correct analysis would be that this is an example of a delayed cadence because you hear the harmony change. It's a type of authentic cadence because it is a 7/7 that then resolves to tonic. So 7/7 is a type of dominant function, and that resolves then to E flat major tonic. And so that is an example of an authentic cadence that is delayed. And so it's delayed because the upper voice retains that 7/7 harmony, that F, the second step of the scale, and it actually goes from F down to the leading tone, D, which is also part of that 7/7, and then it resolves to tonic on the second beat. So now, if he had written it this way, where he did and had kept that 7/7 harmony through the first beat of the 4th measure, then it would have been shifted because you wouldn't have heard the harmony change until you got to the second full, to the second beat. But he didn't do that, and he made that a delayed cadence. And so that is an example of that particular situation. All right. Now, what I'd like to do next is to talk about these basic concepts of simple forms and compound forms. So, I mentioned earlier that simple forms, that is something that is synonymous with song forms. And so, we are going to be looking at song forms when we get to chapter 7, but that then is used within the context of compound forms, which is defined as the combination of two or more simple forms. So, the smallest forms in music are song forms, and they're an example of a simple form. And so we'll see that we have different types of song forms in a moment, but what's going to happen then, this is something that we will look at shortly. And then the first example of a compound form is going to be a minuetted trio, which is comprised of two song forms. So this is typically a large three-part song form for the minuet, and then also a large three-part song form for the trio. And so those two song forms combine together to make this compound form, minuet and trio. Now, in working back and looking at the smaller units then, song forms are comprised of principal parts and auxiliary members. So, auxiliary members are things like introductions and transitions or retransition, and codas, codetta. So these are not essential members. They're optional members of the construction. The essential members are called principal parts. And that is how the name for each of these song forms is determined. So a one-part song form has, as the title denotes, just that one section. So it can be as short as a phrase in length. That is called a one-part song form. So we'll be looking at some examples of all of these. Within the context then of talking about auxiliary members and then principal parts, then you talk about the combination of phrases and so forth. And so when I use this term, combination of phrases, that I'll use the term phrase construction to indicate that. And so that is what we're going to talk about next, is the combination of phrases. So we talked already about the idea of the phrase being the shortest unit terminated by a cadence. And now we are going to talk about combinations of phrases and the phrase construction that would be yielded there. So, what we'll do is use small case letter names to denote a phrase. All right. So, the combination of two phrases equals a period, and then for periods they can either be parallel or contrasting. All right, and so the way that you determine the use of these terms, this is one of the things that's slightly different in the Stein book compared to the Benward text that you have used. And so if you would look at page 40 and find that in your textbook, it talks about the different criteria for determining whether something is parallel or contrasting. But let's just have here as our basic So for periods, for two phrases, then you'll use these terms parallel or contrasting. So if you look at the textbook on page 40, it talks about these four criteria. The first is labeled by identity. And so the thing with the Stein book is that he is comparing the first phrase, and the way that he uses the terminology here, this first phrase is called the antecedent. Then the second phrase is called the consequent phrase. So this antecedent consequent coupling together of phrases is something that's very classical, something that represents a sense of balance and symmetry. And very often the antecedent phrase could end with a half cadence, and the consequent phrase could conclude with an authentic cadence. That's the most stereotyped pattern. But at any rate, you're going to compare the first measure of the antecedent phrase with the first measure of the consequent phrase. And that's all that Stein will look at. It's just the beginning of the phrase. Bendler does the same thing, basically. He might extend it a little beyond the first phrase, so that's the slight difference. But anyway, I'm not going to grade you for if you have the opinion that this is a parallel construction or contrasting. As long as you use the terminology consistently, you're going to be okay. You're going to be good. So in this first one of being parallel by identity, it just means that the first measure of the consequent phrase is parallel, and it's exactly the same, actually, as the first measure of the antecedent. For the second one, it's by transposition, so that's obvious that the consequent phrase, first measure, is a transposition of the first measure of the antecedent. So that's another situation where you would call those being parallel. The third type is, he labels it embellishment, and so same thing, that first measure of the consequent is an embellished repetition of the first measure of the antecedent. But then the final one has to do with contour similarity, and this again is a place maybe where Benward and Stein, a little bit diverge. But with Stein, he's saying that even if the contour, the general direction of the line is similar, of the first full measure, then that is something which would be enough to call that parallel. So we're going to look at this in a lot of different contexts, but that's the way that we're going to use these small case letters, is to indicate phrases and whether or not they are parallel or contrasting with each other. All right. So, combination of two phrases equals a period. Then, if you have three phrases that are combined together, then that equals a phrase group. And so, we'll just write here, phrase group equals three phrases. And so having an extra phrase there compared to a period, that gives you more possibilities for combination. So you can have something like this. That's an example of a phrase group. You could have something like this. That's another. Here's another possibility. And so all of these would be examples of phrase groups. Okay, one basic concept that I want to describe, though, has to do with the idea of exact repetition. If you have an exact repetition of an idea, then we're not going to figure it into determining, what the terminology is for that situation. So what I mean by that is, if you saw the use of repeat signs around a single phrase, and you can find examples of that, that would be the same, and what we would describe that as is a repeated phrase. Which would be the same as that. So, in order for you to call this an exact repetition, every note has to be the same. You can't have one note different. It has to be exactly the same. Now, you can have, different dynamics, but it has to do with the way that, this is notated as far as the exact pitch and duration. All right, so this is something then that if you had this situation, that would be the same as if you had written it this way, which would then be an example of a contrasting period with a repeated antecedent phrase. Okay, so that's a basic idea that we're going to apply at both this level of having repeated phrases, whether it's written with repeat signs or whether it is exactly the same and it's just written out repetition. It can also occur within this context of the period unit. And so, if it's notated this way, you would call that a repeated contrasting period. Equals A, B, A, B. So this is just the written out version of this, which uses repeat signs. And so that's a basic concept I want you to have in mind there. All right. So when we have three phrases, then that will be an example of phrase group. And so these are examples. I mentioned this would be an example of a contrasting period with a repeated antecedent phrase. This would be an example of a contrasting period with a repeated consequent phrase. And this would be an example of a phrase group with a repeated second phrase. So with phrase groups, you just call first, second, third phrase. You don't have the term antecedent and consequent. And so forth. So what I'm going to give you on this first quiz are some different theoretical examples like this. And so if I wrote that